When we think about Pearl Harbor, what's the image that comes to mind? For most of us, it's that single, shocking moment, a total surprise attack, a bolt from the blue on a peaceful Sunday morning. But the truth, well, the truth is a lot messier. The story of that day isn't really about a sudden attack at all. It's a story of ignored warnings, of crucial signals that just got lost in the noise. You see, the war in the Pacific didn't kick off when the first bombs fell. It actually started over an hour earlier, out in the dark, churning waters right at the mouth of the harbor.
So, long before the skies were filled with planes, there was this one single ominous encounter out at sea. The destroyer, USS Ward, she was on a totally routine patrol, just cutting through the pre-dawn mist. The crew was on alert, sure, but they were really just expecting another quiet morning. What they found instead, though, was the very first sign that this day was going to be anything but ordinary.
A lookout spots it first, just this dark shape under the waves, moving deliberately, moving where it absolutely shouldn't be. It's way too small to be a friendly sub, and it's moving with far too much purpose to be a whale. It's a Japanese midget submarine, and it's trying to slip right inside the harbor's anti-submarine nets. Now get this, the Ward's captain, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, is on his very first command patrol. But he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't radio for permission, he just gives the order to fire. And at 6:45 a.m., the Ward's number 3 gun just roars, and a shell rips right through the submarine's conning tower. That was it, the first American shot of the Pacific War. Right after that shot, the Ward races over the sub's position and just rolls depth charges into the water. The message they send back to Naval Headquarters, it's not vague, it's precise, it's urgent, it's crystal clear. But this is where the system starts to break down. You have to remember it's a Sunday morning. Admirals are having breakfast, staff are on a relaxed schedule, and this urgent message gets tangled up in a web of bureaucratic slowness. So instead of setting off an immediate, base-wide alarm, it just sparks debate and, requests for confirmation. The warning shot was fired, but the warning itself, it just wasn't heard. This timeline really just lays out a total cascade of failures. While the Ward's message was slowly making its way up a sleepy chain of command, a second, even bigger warning appeared. At this new kind of experimental radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, 2 privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, they saw something on their screen that was just unbelievable. A signal bigger than anything they had ever seen, bigger than anything they had ever trained for. It was a massive formation of aircraft, 137 miles out and closing in fast. They knew this was huge. They had to. So they called the information center at Fort Shafter. But the officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, well, it was his first day. He knew that a flight of unarmed B-17 bombers was supposed to be flying in from California that morning. So he made an assumption. He picked the routine explanation over the incredibly alarming one. His response to the operators was simple, and it was catastrophic. Don't worry about it. Just 5 words. But those 5 words effectively silenced the last, loudest alarm bell. The sky was literally about to fall, and the men on the ground were told it was nothing. Now, to really get why those planes were in the air in the first place, we have to go back a bit. The attack on Pearl Harbor, it wasn't just some isolated act of aggression. It wasn't born out of a simple desire for conquest. No, it was an act of pure strategic desperation. It was the last move in a high-stakes game that Japan felt it was already losing. The real story actually begins years earlier, in China. Okay, so back in 1937, Japan invades China. They're expecting a quick, clean victory, but instead they get completely bogged down in this brutal, sprawling, and incredibly expensive war. The China Incident, as they called it, basically became a black hole for their resources, and it exposed Japan's greatest weakness. It was this island nation with massive ambitions, but it had almost no natural resources of its own to fuel those ambitions. Every single tank, every ship, every plane, it all depended on foreign supply lines. And this chart, this just illustrates the problem perfectly. By 1940, a staggering 80% of Japan's oil, and oil is the absolute lifeblood of any modern military, was coming from just one country, the United States. Think about that for a second. The very nation that most strongly disapproved of its war in China was the same one keeping its war machine running. This was Japan's fatal flaw, a strategic dependency that put its entire destiny in the hands of a foreign power. So when Japan decided to expand its military into French Indochina, looking for more resources and trying to cut off supplies to China, Washington finally had enough. It wasn't a declaration of war, no, but it was something almost as powerful. President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US, and then came the killer blow, a full oil embargo. The tap was turned off.
For Japan's military leaders, this was basically an economic war. The noose they'd always been afraid of was now tightening around their neck.
The second that embargo hit, Japanese analysts did the math, and the conclusion was stark and, frankly, terrifying. They had at most 18 months of oil reserves left. After that, the Imperial Japanese Navy, the pride of the nation, the key to its whole empire, would be stuck in port. The factories would stop. The war in China would just collapse. So Japan was on a countdown to total national paralysis. They really only had two choices: negotiate a humiliating retreat from China, or go to war to seize the oil-rich territories in Southeast Asia for themselves.
And this is where one man really steps into the spotlight: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. He was a brilliant strategist, a patriot for sure, but he was also a realist. And unlike so many others in the Japanese high command, he knew his enemy. He knew America. He was the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, not because he was sure of victory, but because he saw no other way out.
Yamamoto wasn't ignorant of America's power. Far from it. He was uniquely aware of it. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had traveled across the country and seen with his own eyes the massive car factories in Detroit. He understood that America's industrial capacity was a sleeping giant. He warned his superiors again and again that if war broke out, Japan might have the upper hand for 6 months, maybe a year. But after that, America's ability to just churn out ships and planes and tanks would completely overwhelm them. He knew a long war was simply unwinnable.
And this is absolutely crucial to understand. The Pearl Harbor attack was never designed to conquer the United States. It was a huge, desperate gamble. The entire plan was to deliver one single devastating blow that would wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, crush American morale, and buy Japan a critical window of time, at least 6 months. And in that time, they'd conquer Southeast Asia, secure their oil, and build up a fortified empire. The hope, the prayer really, was that a shocked and bloodied America would then be forced to negotiate to accept Japan's new reality.
But planning the attack meant overcoming a massive technical problem. You see, the U.S. Navy thought Pearl Harbor was basically torpedo-proof from the air. The harbor is only about 40 feet deep. A normal aerial torpedo, when you drop it from a plane, dives much deeper than that before it levels out, so it would just bury itself in the mud at the bottom. The Americans saw this as a natural defense, but Japanese engineers, they saw it as a problem that needed solving, and they solved it brilliantly. They fitted their torpedoes with special wooden fins that would break off when they hit the water, creating just enough lift to make them run straight and true in the shallows. It was a game changer.
The execution of this plan was just a masterpiece of naval logistics and secrecy. On November 26th, the main Japanese strike force, the Kido Butai, 6 aircraft carriers with a whole fleet of battleships and destroyers, slipped out of a remote bay in northern Japan. For almost 2 weeks, they maintained absolute and total radio silence, sailing a really treacherous northern route through stormy seas to avoid all the shipping lanes and any chance of detection. It was an incredible feat of navigation and discipline. And by the pre-dawn hours of December 7th, they had arrived, completely undetected at their launch point 230 miles north of Oahu. Meanwhile, while this secret fleet was sailing across the Pacific, one last, almost bizarre failure was playing out in Washington. Japan was sending a 14-part message to its embassy. It was meant to be delivered to the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull just moments before the attack to formally break off negotiations. But because of slow description and typing at the understaffed embassy, the final message wasn't actually delivered until after the attack had already started. The diplomatic courtesy of a warning, however thin it was lost to a clerical error. And so that was it. All the warnings had been missed. The radar signal was dismissed, the diplomatic note was delayed, the submarine report was stalled. On Oahu, it's just a perfect Sunday morning. Church bells are starting to ring, sailors are sleeping in, getting ready for shore leave. On the decks of the battleships, bands are actually setting up to play the morning colors. The peace is just absolute. And then, at 7:55 a.m., that peace is shattered forever. The first wave of 183 Japanese planes achieves complete and total surprise. Their main targets are the 8 American battleships moored right along Ford Island, an area known as Battleship Row. Those modified torpedoes, they work perfectly. The USS Oklahoma is hit by multiple torpedoes and just rolls over in minutes. The USS West Virginia and California sink right where they're moored. But the most devastating blow of all comes when a Japanese armor-piercing bomb, dropped from a high-altitude bomber, smashes through the decks of the USS Arizona, and detonates its forward ammunition magazine. The entire ship just explodes in a terrifying fireball, instantly killing 1,177 sailors and Marines. The human cost of this sudden violence it's almost impossible to comprehend. Over 400 men were trapped inside the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma when it capsized. For days after the attack, rescue crews could hear them, a faint, desperate knocking from inside that steel tomb. They managed to cut through the hull and save 32 men. But eventually, the knocking just faded away. A horrifying testament to the suffering in those first few minutes. Now, from a purely tactical viewpoint, the attack was a stunning success. The Japanese pilots performed with incredible skill, and in less than 2 hours, they had crippled the very heart of the US Pacific Fleet. But here's the thing. Winning a single battle and winning a war are two very, very different things. And this is where we start to see how Japan's brilliant tactical victory actually contained the seeds of its own ultimate defeat.
The commander of the Japanese strike force, Admiral Nagamo, he was a cautious man. After the first 2 waves of planes returned, he made a decision that would change the course of the war. He canceled the planned 3rd wave and ordered the fleet to turn back. He was afraid of a possible American counterattack, especially since nobody knew where the US carriers were. But this decision meant that several absolutely critical targets were left completely untouched. The huge oil storage tanks holding millions of barrels of fuel were not hit. The submarine base was ignored. And most importantly, the shipyard and all its repair facilities were left intact.
And then, of course, there was the most important factor of all: pure, dumb luck. By sheer chance, all 3 of the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, which would prove to be the most important ships in the coming war, were not in port that day. They were all out at sea on missions. Sinking battleships, well, that was a blow to American pride, but in this new era of naval warfare, carriers were everything. By missing the carriers, sparing the fuel, and leaving the repair docks standing, Nagamo had ensured that Pearl Harbor, while a total disaster, was a recoverable one. The fleet was badly wounded, yes, but it wasn't killed. Yamamoto's entire gamble was based on this idea that a devastating attack would just shatter American morale and force them to the negotiating table. And that, perhaps, was his greatest miscalculation. He understood America's industrial power, but he fundamentally misunderstood its psychological strength and its political will. The attack didn't break the American spirit. It forged it into a single, unified, and furious purpose. This quote, and, historians debate whether he actually said it, but it perfectly captures the result of the attack. Whether Yamamoto said those exact words or not, the sentiment is 100% true. Before December 7th, America was a nation deeply divided about getting into the war. After December 7th, isolationism just vanished overnight. The attack united the country in a way nothing else could have, creating this terrible resolve for one thing and one thing only: total victory. Look at this number, 47,836. That is the number of aircraft the United States produced in 1942 alone. It's the perfect symbol of the industrial giant that Japan had just awakened. Those factories Yamamoto had seen in Detroit all those years ago, they roared to life, outproducing all of the Axis powers combined. This was an industrial tsunami that Japan simply had no way of competing with. Yamamoto's greatest fear had become a reality. And this brings us to the final bitter irony for Japan. Those American carriers that were lucky enough to be absent from Pearl Harbor, they became the very instruments of Japan's downfall. Just 6 months later, at the Battle of Midway, U.S. naval forces, using intelligence they gathered in part because the sub-base at Pearl Harbor was still operational, they ambushed the Japanese fleet, and in a single day, they sank 4 of the 6 elite aircraft carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. The tide of the war in the Pacific turned on a dime, and Japan would never be on the offensive again. So when you look back at it, Pearl Harbor is really a paradox, isn't it? On one hand, it was a brilliantly planned and flawlessly executed military operation, a tactical masterpiece. But on the other hand, it was a profound strategic catastrophe that sealed the fate of the entire Japanese empire. It was an attack designed to prevent a war that Japan knew it couldn't win, which instead guaranteed that very war would be fought to its absolute devastating conclusion. It just remains one of history's most powerful lessons on how a single day, a few missed warnings, and one terrible miscalculation can change the entire world.